Nate, did you get my email this morning?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't forward that on to the other party, so I'm waiting to see what she says next.
Yeah, if she can find it, that would be great. Otherwise, she has to start over. But uh,
Right.
it'll. The way that I see it is that the initial email was nonsense anyway.
Right.
Because it's like, emails and phones work two ways,
Yeah.
and the fact that what you sent, you know,
Was it
I
helpful?
yeah. So,
All
but
right. I'll give it a day or two and then I'll follow up.
yeah, sounds.
Okay.
We can just hi, Chair Watt, this is Floresto. We're just working on some connection, potential challenges for the other trustees that log on. So I'm expecting Dr. Rogers to attend too. Is it all right if we just wait a few minutes to try to give everyone a chance to log on?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Depending on how Floresta goes, I'll have to leave about 12:15. I'm assuming we'll be done, but
Yeah, I don't think for us it's going to take that long. He could if we ask.
yeah.
I don't think he will.
Okay.
Hi, Kate. Congratulations on your reappointment.
Hi, thank you. You're stuck with me.
For you and me for another 4 years, and
We're in it together.
then we can ride off into the
Yeah.
sunset.
That's what I thought.
And 50 years later,
The sunset keeps getting pushed back.
the literal long walk on the beach watching the sunset, and you're still walking. So
Right.
and Kate, Bresto, and them are just working on some connection issues for Dr. Rogers, so he should be here soon, and then we'll get started.
Cool. No rush on my account.
All right, good morning, everyone. Sorry for my tardiness. These meetings, they go back to back. They don't allow any time for transition or comfort break. So
Same. Glad to see you.
Floresto, do you mind or can the presenter's laptop bring up the agenda?
Sure. Lord and Tyler.
We're working on it. It'll be up in a second.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I think the first item is I go off memory is we'll officially call the meeting to order at 11:02. And could we do roll call?
Dr. Keith Rogers,
Present.
Nathaniel Waugh,
Here.
Trustee Turner Whiteley,
Here.
and then for the record, I did see Trustee Sanchez.
Hello.
Hi, and I believe that was everyone.
Okay, thank you. Do we have anyone sign up for public comment?
No.
All right, well, I'll spare us reading the public comment directives. Then we'll go to committee action to accept the proposed agenda. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, any questions on readiness? Hearing none, we'll call for the question. All those in favor say aye.
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 All right, motion carries. We have an approved agenda. We'll go to our new business. So Floresto, I presume that you will share your presentation and walk us through all the updates.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rogers. And I will share my presentation now. Good morning, everyone. For the record, my name is Floresto Caballas, Chief Financial Officer. What we're reviewing today is a preliminary budget developed in compliance with Nevada revised statutes and will be submitted to the Department of Taxation by April 15th. Note that the figures presented are subject to revision as we continue to refine the budget over the next month, and the final budget will be presented to the Board of Trustees at the May 22nd budget hearing. I'll begin with an overview of projected revenues across all funds. For fiscal year 2026, the general fund is expected to see an increase in revenue, primarily driven by property tax collections rising. This is a reflection of continued growth in assessed property tax values. The capital projects fund also shows an increase. This is due to higher anticipated investment income, which remains strong despite interest rates expected to decline, largely because of favorable investment positions secured in prior years. The special revenue funds, which includes gifts and grants, are budgeted at levels that allow flexibility to accommodate unanticipated revenues. This is why the budgets here are $10 million and $20 million respectively for gifts and grants. We can't determine the exact likelihood of receiving $20 million in state or federal awards, for example, but staff is seeking the greatest amount possible, and there is a potential for awards of this amount. For example, we're applying for federal appropriations of up to $7 million total for the West Las Vegas project and improvements to the Rainbow Library. And finally, and importantly, the district continues to operate debt-free, which is why a nominal amount is budgeted in the debt service fund.
So Floresto, could you clarify, like when we talk about like the 7 million, is that different from the new market tax credits that's contributing to the project?
Yes, that's correct. So those are additional funds that we're seeking or applying for in the upcoming fiscal year. And we are continuing to pursue new markets funding as well.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Floresto, just if I could ask you to do a hypothetical for me, because this will help with work up here in Carson City. So there's a measure right now to which would go to the voters for property tax reset on resale. What would that look like for our budget if something like that happened? If when a home is sold or property is sold, that the property tax is reassessed to reflect, what would that look like for us?
assuming that the reset is at, current market assessed values, that could increase our potential property tax revenues. They, I would believe, are still subject to the 3% cap for residential property and 8% cap for commercial property. But, if that's true, that would possibly maximize the amount of property taxes that are available. And in this current environment, I was going to reference, I just mentioned the rising property values here, which is why our property taxes are increasing. So that would be my expectation. But Sherwa, is your understanding that the reset could throttle potential values and lower the caps even further?
The intent of the sponsor is that um, is that the tax rate, I guess, which I don't own property, so I don't I don't pay that, but is that right now that when a home is resold, that the tax rate for the purchaser of the home remains the same, whereas this would where if this passed and the voters approved it and it went into effect, when a home is sold, then the tax rate would be reassessed based on the new buyer, and then the new buyer would ostensibly pay a higher tax rate than the seller did for their property taxes every year. And the idea that the sponsor has is that this would improve funding for education, libraries, public services like that. That right now is just, this is kind of where we're at, and that, obviously it shifts because of, the changes in property values, but this would allow it to be a little more dynamic. I haven't dug into the cap, which I believe I've heard people mention the cap would be a part of this as well, but I haven't read too much into that. I was just curious in general what kind of that would look like if we were seeing kind of a more dynamic scale with property once it's being sold and resold and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. That aligns with what I just described. It reminds me of a local finance government group that was lobbying for something similar, because what's happening with the caps is it's artificially putting a ceiling on the amount of assessed value and potential property tax revenues we can receive. So in a hypothetical, as you asked about, a property could, in theory, drop in value. In the current market, I think a lot here understands that because of a lot of property owners locked in the lower interest rates, that they're not motivated to move. That's creating a lower supply, which is maintaining property values and could be increasing them in some areas, including in Southern Nevada. But if the market were to turn and those fair market values were to decrease, then because the caps over time have put a ceiling on assessed values, it's possible and actually likely that the assessed value, which is the basis for our property tax revenues, could still increase. And again, hopefully that makes sense, and that a fair market value might drop by 10%, for example, but the assessed value, because they're being throttled by the caps, could easily increase by 10% if the caps allowed it, despite fair market values dropping. So again, in this environment, if that passes, I would expect property tax values or property tax revenues for the district to increase even further.
I'll send you the bill so you can take a look at it, and then we can touch base on it another time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. On the expenditure side of the all funds presentation you're seeing here, the general fund is increasing largely due to personnel costs. In the capital projects fund, planned expenditures are higher due to several major projects: the West Las Vegas library construction, technology replacements and upgrades across our system, and needed maintenance and repair work on our buildings. Again, the special revenue funds remain flexible and responsive to potential opportunities. If we receive $20 million in grant funds, but don't budget at least $20 million in expenditures, we're unable to spend the full $20 million because we can't exceed total expenditures budgeted. And as I mentioned, the district carries no debt. Zooming into the general fund, property tax revenues continue to grow as assessed values appreciate across our service area, and that's what we just discussed. In the consolidated sales tax line item you see here, known as the CTX, that's projected to remain flat. Given the current economic trends, though, we're taking a cautious approach here. In the April Financial Services Board reports, I explained that staff can't report monthly CTX comparisons accurately at this time because the State Department of Taxation is updating its financial system. As a result, the November 2024 CTX payment, which is normally sent to the district at the end of January 2025, there's normally a 2-month lag here, was sent 15 days earlier at a lower amount. So this made January's revenue look much lower than expected. Now, the state has gone back to its usual end of month schedule and plans to make up the lost revenue in the coming months. So we should be able to fine tune our revenue expectations going forward. But at this time, predicting property or CTX revenues is always difficult. And this is just another uncertainty that's driving our cautious approach to the budget, since we're not as comfortable with where we're going to end up at the end of the fiscal year in terms of property or CTX tax collections. I keep referring back to property tax values as we're just discussing them. That's our primary source of revenue, but the C-tax is our second largest source of revenues. We expect no significant changes in revenues for charges for services. There is also no change in miscellaneous revenue, but examples of miscellaneous revenue are fees for passport services, sales of small supplies like flash drives or earbuds. But the most significant item here is E-rate, which is short for education rate. E-rate is a federal program managed by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. It provides funds to offset the cost of internet access and tech infrastructure. And again, the trustees may be aware of this, but the Supreme Court is currently reviewing a case challenging the constitutionality of the program. And depending on the decision by the Supreme Court, which is expected later this year, I believe in June, this could mean $300,000 in lost revenues for the district. That's what's budgeted in this line item. And this is yet another variable in the uncertainty that we're facing in this upcoming budget year. Despite a broader expectation of lower interest rates, our investment income is still expected to increase. And again, this is due to higher yields we locked in over the last couple of years, giving us some carryover benefit heading into the new fiscal year, 2026.
Floresta, with respect to the case being heard by the Supreme Court, who pays that rate? Is it the individual, or is it a reimbursement that we pursue through government?
Who pays it are actually private companies. For example, Cox Communications that provides internet service. And that is on a reimbursement basis. So this is the budget impact, in that we plan to incur those costs anyway, but really we get a discount on those services we provide, not to mention our own connection to broadband by these companies basically, giving us a discount in the form of federal subsidies they receive from the FCC. And there's actually another organization involved here. But this is where the constitutional challenge is coming into play, in that because these aren't direct federal subsidies provided to organizations, especially local governments, and they're coming from private organizations. Again, I would need special counsel to go into this in more detail, but that's the challenge, in that, these private organizations that are passing on these subsidies, basically in the form of a discount, is being challenged in the court right now. And it'll be a few months before we get a decision. But again, this is something that staff has in mind as we're preparing the upcoming budget.
Okay, thank you for that explanation.
Yep. Turning to general fund expenditures, salaries and benefits are budgeted to increase because of pay increases that are effective July 1st, 2025, which is consistent with negotiated agreements. Services and supplies are also projected to rise, primarily due to cost escalations in core contracts, something that we're seeing across the board. We've also continued to prioritize library media materials, and that's the board's commitment to allocate at least 15% of total expenditures to support our collection and digital resources. Staff put in significant effort to control costs across the board in the operating fund this year. The increases you're seeing here are actually modest, considering the new West Las Vegas library will be opening in fiscal year 2026. And opening a new library is going to involve new staff positions and increased services and supplies expenditures to support the additional programming that we have planned. This is one of the reasons that Executive Director Watson chose not to add new positions in the current year, fiscal year 2025. The fiscal year 2025 budget anticipated additional operating costs in fiscal year 2026 from a new library. And the administrative team is also actively controlling spending in the current fiscal year with the intent to save up to $3 million in services and supplies alone compared to the budget. And also, vacant positions are not being filled in the current year where it's not critical to provide ongoing services. When preparing the fiscal year 2025 budget a year ago, we couldn't anticipate the risks to federal funding arising from these executive orders from a new administration, but we do always budget for the possibility that some intervening force could adversely affect our financial position. Yeah, and that's where the ending fund balance comes into play. This reserve reflects our commitment to, as always, financial resilience that enables us to handle emergencies or unanticipated needs without disrupting our operation. The general fund is projected to close fiscal year 2026 with an ending fund balance of about $15.3 million, which is 15% of total expenditures, which is what staff feels is a safe reserve at this time. After the financial crisis and throughout the Great Recession, we actually maintained an ending fund balance of 20%. Also reflected in the budget is an $18 million transfer to the Capital Projects Fund. And I do want to emphasize here that this is a planned transfer. If at any point during the fiscal year we find that the general fund resources requires these funds for urgent needs, the full transfer may not happen. So again, flexibility is built into our financial strategy as always.
And then for Resto, what's sort of the timing of like when would these capital project fund transfers happen? Not necessarily this year, but like last year, like when would those transfers occur during the fiscal period?
They can happen anytime throughout the fiscal year. Sometimes we do transfer because there's a cash flow need, but we have built reserves over time to insulate the district from the kind of economic challenges we've seen recently and upcoming. So we could control the cash flows for these transfers, meaning we could transfer all $18 million on July 1st, the beginning of the fiscal year. But of course, we would play it by ear, watch our incoming revenues come in, and then determine at that time where the cash flows are needed and transfer as needed. We are so prepared, we could probably hold off to the end of fiscal year, which is what we've been doing this current fiscal year in making the complete transfers. So if there were a sudden change in cash flows, for example, revenues come in lower than expected, or we lose federal funding for all the reasons that we just talked about, this is where we would not transfer the full amount. And again, going back to the pandemic example, that's exactly what we did. We had about $16 million budgeted to transfer in 2020, and we transferred about half of it. So our approach, came in handy during that time where we knew that consolidated sales tax revenue were going to fall off a cliff. The entire city shut down for a few months. And so that's the lever we can pull if needed for urgent needs in the operating fund.
All right, thank you for that additional detail.
Flores, so given that kind of preparedness that you mentioned and kind of, as you're looking at, because I guess the economic situation, as you kind of mentioned, there may be some kind of mirrors to the pandemic. Do you foresee a need to, at this point, to recommend some kind of VEST program again, or are we in a financial position where we don't have to worry about trying to transition, employees out who may be eligible for retirement soon, because we don't need those resources necessarily?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because it's a great point. The VEST was really necessary, a few years ago when the pandemic started, but that was a large investment. The district paid about $4.5 million or so. Well, actually, that's a different figure. It was lower, but it was millions of dollars basically to pay long-term employees or encourage them to retire in order to lower costs. And fortunately, as I mentioned, the investment paid off in the form of personnel cost savings over time that have really built up our reserve all the way up until now. We broke even fairly quickly because there were such long-term employees at the higher end of the pay scale that we recovered the cost of those millions of dollars in vest payouts. And it lowered our overall, cost structure in personnel. And so at this time, I wouldn't suggest another vest. It would be costly, for one thing, especially because of all the risks to funding for large projects like the West Las Vegas. It would be $2, $3, $4 million that could be invested in those projects and future projects. And the amount of institutional knowledge we lost at that time during the first vest has been recovered, as far as I'm concerned. And those of us, the entire team across the district, have stepped up and are able to and have a long runway in terms of longevity. So there would be no need basically to encourage any further, early retirements. And the district could definitely use the team members it has at this point. One of the things that is not, incorporated into our budget, despite all of the cautions we're taking, is reduced staffing. So again, I appreciate the board's support in pulling whatever levers are needed to ensure, our operations, at least our core services, can continue without risk. But yeah, to answer your question, Sherwa, I don't feel the need to recommend that at this time.
Thank you.
I believe I left off with the ending fund balance in the special revenue funds and the debt fund. And these funds are structured to break even each year. So their ending fund balance remains consistent at $528,000, $312,000, and $594,000. The funds are designed for specific uses and provide transparency and accountability in how we manage the gift fund, the grant fund, and debt obligations. Lastly, we are planning an $18 million transfer, as I mentioned, from the general fund to support critical programs. These include the technology upgrades program, infrastructure improvements, and construction-related expenses, specifically the West Las Vegas library project. These programs are highlighted in yellow, as you can see, and they are the programs we continue to fund despite limited resources. Going back to the pandemic example, we stopped spending in the other programs, but not here, not in these three programs in particular. It is worth noting that the budget for this fund does not currently include potential savings from the New Markets Tax Credit Program. Going back to Dr. Rogers' point, given ongoing uncertainty around federal funding, we chose to take a conservative budget approach here too. At the last Finance Committee meeting, we presented a New Markets update, and it was Trustee White that highlighted the need to expedite the federal portion of these funds, which is worth $3 million. I informed the committee that the state portion was secure because it was not subject to federal purview. Shortly thereafter, the state itself, specifically the Attorney General's office, questioned whether the deal fully complied with statutes. So suddenly, this put another $3 million of state funding for the West Las Vegas project at risk. Fortunately, the New Markets team was able to address the state's concerns, and the project is moving forward. Again, a thank you to all of our partners there. We have a dream team of New Markets experts that made that happen and are continuing to keep the ball rolling in seeking and achieving these funds. I believe Crescent Growth Capital is attending here today. So again, Ryan and Troy, thank you if you're there listening. But again, I'm becoming a broken record. This is another variable that staff is evaluating when budgeting this year. So I'll finish by just reiterating the broader climate of financial uncertainty that's shaping our budget approach this year. CTX revenues are even more difficult to forecast at this time. A brand new library branch is driving our operating costs up. Funding for that new library is by no means in the bank yet. I just talked about federal appropriations, not to mention the New Markets program that's being challenged. along with E-rate. There's a risk to support from the IMLS or Institute of Museum and Library Services, which affects our collection. And again, I already discussed the New Markets Tax Credit Program, which is worth another $6 million total in construction funds to support the completion of that project. In response, though, under the executive director's instructions and guidance, we're approaching this budget cycle with as much caution as possible, preparing for unexpected expenses and preparing for long-term priorities. The executive director and administrative team are already looking to update the long-term strategic plan playbook. And of course, every budget that we discuss affects that, but especially this one. So I'm really glad to see that a lot of the trustees and are able to attend along with the committee members today, because this budget is different because of the uncertainty that we've been talking about throughout this presentation. And I mentioned this too, but the budget does not propose any reductions in library staff. You know, the goal is to preserve the integrity of our core services and to provide the flexibility and growth and our investments in technology, facility upkeep, and the materials budget. In other words, we're preparing for any fiscal shifts, whether it's from federal funding losses, economic slowdowns, or any other emergencies. And we are moving forward towards finalizing the budget for board review next month. I believe the budget hearing is scheduled for May 22nd at the May budget meeting. And staff will continue monitoring everything as closely as possible and reporting back to the trustees. Thank you, Dr. Rogers.
All right, I'll open up to see if there were any other questions of Floresto and his presentation.
Hi, Floresto, me again. So I'm glad you addressed the question about staffing reductions or service reductions, because that was going to be my question. But so if you had to, I guess, project further out. So right now, this fiscal year, we're in a decent place if we have to absorb those loss of revenue. What does that look like, worst case scenario, if we look at next fiscal year, if we've kind of burned through these reserves to kind of fill gaps this year, what could that look like, next year when we're in this position?
And I think you're referring to fiscal year 2027.
Yes.
Worst case scenario, it would affect longer term projects. And that's where, I highlighted our focus on longer term projects, because we have prepared well enough that we will complete the West Las Vegas project as planned. It will open and provide the services and programming that staff has planned and that the trustees and the community expects. But without, for example, the federal funding that's being invested in that project, not to mention all the other federal support that we receive and the risk to state funding even. I mentioned that even the New Markets state portion is at risk, and that's worth $3 million. Even without all of those additional resources, that project will finish. And as you pointed out, Chair Wad, we will move on business as usual. But the impact of millions of dollars, even less than the millions of dollars, I mentioned the E-rate program, which is worth anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000, will affect 2027 and beyond. The administrative team has already identified some service needs around our area that potentially includes a brand new library. So, of course, the worst case scenario that we're hypothetically looking at would significantly slow down any move forward in a project that large. And that is the obvious example of a capital initiative that would be put on the back burner, but programming itself could be affected. And Executive Director Watson, spoke to this well and thoroughly at the prior board meeting when he addressed, the risk of federal funding that's affecting our programming. The core services will continue, but it could limit the district's ability to provide, even more programming on other signature events, for example. But we would invest as much as possible, taking advantage of the reserves we had to continue at least those programs. And of course, this would be under the direction of the executive director, but we would prioritize, and my expectation would be the major capital initiatives like a brand new library, something like a steam truck or vehicle that can do more outreach, is what will be put at risk. And of course, another factor, I also highlighted are revenues. So again, worst case scenario, we go into a deep recession that affects consumer spending. That's another large source of revenue that would affect all of the programming services and projects I described. We're prepared for the future, but this is where every budget year, we're looking at 2026 now, but the time value of money, as you all know, will compound the effect of our financial resources in either direction. Either things will go our way and we can continue as planned and have some flexibility in how we strategically identify priorities in different service areas, or we may have to hunker down even further, just like we did during the pandemic.
Thank you. And I just want to acknowledge you and your team. And you guys are the closest things we have to fortune tellers on staff in the district. But I appreciate the work and the flexibility that you and your team have had to kind of do now, and of course keep an eye as things seem to be shifting every day. So thank you.
Thank you.
Right, I'll leave it open to see if my fellow trustees have any further questions.
This is Elaine Sanchez. I have a question.
Go ahead.
This is for Floresto. Hi, how are you doing?
Hi, Trustee Sanchez.
Hi. What is the highest amount of federal funding that we could lose this fiscal year? What do you have that number?
What sticks out is the new markets tax credit program. There is at least another $3 million in federal funding that we're seeking that is potentially at risk. And the other $3 million I mentioned is not subject to risk by the federal government, but is still at risk under the state's purview. And so that's a total of $6 million. We are applying for the federal appropriations I mentioned, which is roughly $5 million in funding from the senator's offices for the West Las Vegas project, and another about $1.5 million for refresh improvements for the Rainbow Library. There are other areas, I think I alluded to them. The IMLS that I discussed, we aren't expecting any, or we don't know of any direct awards from the IMLS at this time for the upcoming fiscal year. But the IMLS organization does support the state library, which supports a grant that the district receives for collection development. And that could be anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000 that affects our collection. And that's an indirect impact. Again, we don't receive those funds directly from the federal government, but the IMLS organization effectively being shut down because of executive orders, will have ripple effects across the country for libraries, and we're included. And so that's the $300,000 potential impact that I just mentioned. So those are the numbers that stick out off the top of my head. And as you can see, they're very significant to our budget and our operation.
Yes, and I was wondering at our meeting, is it possible to have that for all of us as trustees? Because I think for me, that's really important. It's a number. It would be good to have that number. Like, what is the highest amount of federal funding that we could lose, just so that way we have that in our heads, and if we can have it like in detail as far as like itemization, I just think it's helpful. The other thing is, you had mentioned that you've not filled any vacancies. Do you know what that number is and what the average amount of pay is for that position?
That is something we can work to quantify. We have been filling vacancies, but where we can control them. And for example, one area is the adult learning program, which is a federally funded, supported program where, again, we're not sacrificing services provided to the community where not needed, but we do have planned reorganizations of that department in order to increase our ability to provide services, those literacy services to residents. And so that's an area where our planned reorganization would be paused. And that includes vacancies and conversions of positions that would not take place at least this fiscal year. And I mentioned that we have moved forward as planned with filling vacancies as needed, because we had that ability. The turn of events here has been very sudden, as you all know, and staff has pivoted, as needed, and that's one example. Again, staff can quantify that impact, but we aren't going to pause where not necessary. I just gave you one example of a department where we could pause, and we have been nimble in adjusting staffing around the district in order to meet service needs. But because we have that room for vacancies that we are evaluating all the time and figuring out where we can make conversions to, for example, increase staffing at the West Las Vegas Library when it opens next fiscal year. And that's what we've done. But again, yes, staff will work on that reporting, including the numbers that you requested to quantify the maximum amount of federal funds that are at risk. This is already a direction that we've received from Executive Director Watson to increase our communication in this area. We're working on information that could be summarized and digested easily internally. We have a lot of questions from team members across the district. And of course, we'll also pass on that information to the trustees.
I appreciate it. Yeah, if we could just, find that out, how many vacancies we've not filled, because that's helpful to know, and what does that cost, and certainly it's just good information to know. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Trustee Whiteley, did you have any questions?
No, I didn't. Chairman Waugh, he asked my question.
All right. Nate's good about that.
Got it covered. And that was a great presentation for us. So thank you so much.
Yes. Yes, you and the team always do a phenomenal job and thorough job. A few questions that I was going to ask you, you covered them in your presentation. So not that we don't have lots of questions, but I think it's more of a tribute to just the thoroughness of your presentation. So we appreciate that. And just again, this was for discussion only as basis for preparing the tentative budget for submittal to the State of Nevada Department of Taxation on April 15, 2025. All right, I think that is it for new business. So we will see if we have anyone sign up for public comment.
No public comment.
Hearing that no one has signed up, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Do you have a second?
Second.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Bye.
Aye. All right. All right. We are officially adjourned. Thank you, everyone. We'll have a great rest of the day and week.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
For this beautiful weather.
Bye.
Thank you.